Good morning, everybody. It's day 11, which is our third week of recording.
Good morning. Happy Monday. Good to see everybody again. We're glad you're joining us on this little professional development talk, this little journey that we're taking 5 days a week. So I'm glad to see you all back with us today.
Yeah, and today we are talking about an article we wrote for Educational Leadership's issue, The Empowered Student, which came out in March. And it includes an article that we wrote called The Curse of Helicopter Teaching, which we linked on the Padlet so that people could read it along with us. So talk to me about the book you were going to mention.
Yeah, so I think, you and I have been thinking a lot, long before this book came out that I'm about to share, but we've been thinking a lot about who's doing the work in the classroom. And, if you've been in the classroom for a while, we always have this kind of thought, am I doing too much of the work? And how much is enough and how much is not enough? And am I enabling my students, right?
Yeah.
And then in the midst of us having this conversation over the last few years, then this book came out, Modeling of the American Mind, written by two college professors who make the argument in the book that there's a danger in doing too much for kids. There's a danger in, making sure their pathway is smooth and that they do not encounter any bumps in life. I'd like to read maybe just a passage or two from it. They say here that on page 23, that given the risks and stressors are natural, unavoidable parts of life, parents and teachers should be helping kids develop their innate abilities to grow and learn from such experiences. There's an old saying, prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. But these days, we seem to be doing precisely the opposite. We're trying to clear away anything that might upset children, not realizing that in doing so, we're repeating the peanut allergy mistake. And earlier in the book, they talk about how schools, when they banned peanuts, actually made the peanut allergy issue worse because kids were never exposed to it. If we protect children from various classes of potentially upsetting experiences, we make it far more likely that those children will be unable to cope with such events when they leave our protective umbrella. The modern obsession with protecting young people from feeling unsafe is, we believe, one of the several causes of the rapid rise in adolescent depression, anxiety, and suicide. And so as you know, since we've talked about this book a whole lot, this well-intentioned and well-meaning idea of, helicopter parents. And one of the major thesis of the book is that helicopter parenting actually weakens kids. And so you and I have had many, many discussions. This book sort of launched us into the idea, well, if helicopter parenting is bad, what about the idea of helicopter teaching?
Yeah, and don't they even in that book go a little farther and say that people have moved from being helicopter parents to snowplow parents, where they just clear everything, every obstacle? And I found that fascinating because when I was in university teaching in the early 90s, I had a student teacher who was having trouble, and her mother called me at home. And I said, your daughter is a senior in college and you're calling me. She needs to advocate for herself. And I think that what they have named in that book is that with the best of intentions, and that's true for teachers as well, with the best of intentions to help everyone, we sometimes do too much, and that struggle matters.
When children are raised in a culture of safetyism, which teaches them to stay emotionally safe while protecting them from every imaginable danger, it may actually set up a feedback loop. Kids become more fragile and less resilient, which signals to adults that they need more protection, which then makes them even more fragile and less resilient. And I can help but read that and think about my practices as a teacher, especially the teaching of writing. We hear this a lot, right? Kids can't write, so we have to scaffold the hell out of it for them because they can't. And so that, I think, creates kind of that helpless loop as well. And we've gotten to the point where kids feel like they can't unless the teacher does a lot of the lifting for them.
Yeah, I think that I've shared you and others that my first semester on campus that I really felt like, oh, it's going to be different because now I've only got the kids who go to college. And the truth was they were so handcuffed by good intentions of teachers having given them one form to practice again and again, and having done the hard decision making for them, that they didn't believe they could do it on their own. And the truth is that, just like I've said, all reading in college is independent reading. Well, all writing in college is as well. There are not the step-by-step do this way. It's assigned in almost all the content areas, assigned topic, which is a big open-ended question, and no rubric. It's, they're really looking for you to share your thinking. And I think that my students say, I'm not good at academic writing. We're having a hard time helping kids understand what it means to really own their own voice and their own structures in particular.
Right. And I know the answer to this question. So I'm intentionally playing the devil's advocate because you know exactly how I would answer this question. But for the purposes of this conversation, what would you say then to teachers who propose the argument? Well, yeah, I get it. We have to get kids eventually to independence as writers, but the way to get them there is teaching them the 5-paragraph essay. And then once they have learned the structure of an essay, then I can gradually release them, because we hear that argument a lot.
We do. And you know what? I was thinking that question exactly as you were talking, because one of the missteps of that is the same misstep with all whole class novels. We think that if we don't hold their hands, they'll never get it on their own, or if we don't design everything, they can't get there. And so the same thinking of who's doing most of the work is around that question. And the other piece, the other essential piece, is engagement. And so I've had teachers say their 5-paragraph essays are just as bad as they were in the fall. That's why we continue to practice on. I'm like, but there's no reason for them to learn that form. They know what the form is. My son used to say it, top 10 of his class. And he would say, Mom, you just slap it together, use a quote the teacher liked, use a and throw it together, get your B- and move on. There was no interest in working to make sense. Like that rhetorical triangle that we talk about so much. Like, who's your audience? Well, there's no audience for that kind of writing. And so they're limited by what to me is the power and the joy of learning to write. They don't experience that. So they're limited by this little box over here that they're circling, which doesn't build confidence and definitely doesn't build interest.
Yeah, when you did it just came to me that when my daughter was in high school, I think as a junior or senior, she was in an AP class. And she came to me and she said, Dad, I need a little help on this introduction, which surprised me because my daughter never came to me for help. And so I read the introduction to her essay and I said, yeah, it sounds really choppy to me. Why don't you consider combining some sentences, kind of play with your syntax a little bit here? And she said to me, I can't. The teacher says the paragraph has to have 8 sentences, 2 of these sentences, 3 of these sentences, 2 of these sentences. And my daughter already at that point in her life wrote way better than anything that teacher was trying to pigeonhole them in to. But I also want to say that, and I agree with absolutely everything you said, but when it comes to the weaning them off structure and then moving them into unstructured, kids making their own decisions, I think it's a false either or. Both of us have written books in which we argue that the way you help kids write something is to set them next to a piece that's authentic and have them really analyze. I don't care if you're having them write a Yelp review or you're having them write a letter to their congresswoman. They need to stand next to letters to congresswomen. They need to stand next to Yelp reviews. It's not, there's no 5-paragraph essay that's going to most influence my congresswoman, right? It's this model over here that doesn't follow that script and has an authenticity, has a voice to it that's stifled when you create, that structure.
It is absolutely true and important teaching. But here's the thing people get hung up on, Kelly, that we're not even talking about. And that is that it's harder to grade what you're talking about. And so one of my friends who taught in the state of Washington had 250 middle school kids, told me that they practiced the 5-paragraph essay because she could go through them like this. And that's a survival strategy. But I also feel like it's that if all kids are going to write the same Yelp interview, we're going to study or review, we're going to study one review and write it just like that, you're making the same exact mistake. And so I always say kids need a stack of texts. When you enter a genre unit of study, stand next to this one, this one, this one. And you do that so well of helping kids see like the big picture of the essay and then how its parts work together. And I've used a lot of how I've watched you do that in my work to make it better. But I think that the critical place for me is they need texts that are written by professionals, texts that are written by other kids, and they need the text that's evolving in the hands of their own teacher who's saying, oh, I started here, and now that I'm learning more about my topic, I should have started over here, and is just modeling process, because no model is a model of the struggle except the teacher.
So you have that kid sitting in your room who is a non-writer. He's coming in, you know. Well, let me birdwalk a little bit and ask you this: have you ever written a grant proposal?
Yeah, I'm the president of the
What'd
Foundation.
what did you do the first time you ever had to write a grant proposal?
I went and looked up grant proposals, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
You didn't map out your 5 paragraphs. You went out in the real world, right? This is how we learn. We stand next to somebody who knows how to do it, and we read and analyze and emulate what that person does, right? I ask my kids this all the time. How many of you have learned how to do something in your life based on watching a YouTube video? And every kid raises his hand. Well, that's how you learn how to write. You learn how to write by standing next to people who know how to write and really reading like a writer and diving in there and analyzing, you know, how it's done. How is it said is a level of reading that, unless you're in an AP language class, you know, is not generally a kind of reading that kids have honed very deeply. And again,
does that even make sense when the Common Core standards made 1/3 of the reading standards? How is it written? You say that, and I agree with you, but how is it that we don't teach that more across all grade levels?
well, I think it's changing. And I think, you know, that the SAT now is valuing that kind of thing and that kind of thinking too.
Yeah.
So I think maybe it is turning in that direction. But, you know, for years, I used shared mouse thinking, adapted a little bit to this idea that, you know, what are the kinds of reading we want our kids to do? What does it say? What does it mean? What does it matter? And now I would add, how is it said and who said it, right? And do I trust the source, especially in this day and age of misinformation? So getting kids to do that kind of reading, I think, is really, you know, it's interesting. I can take a kid who, you know, only writes this much, but if we, and I've done this in some of my books and so have you, but if you really kind of spend time with mentor text, you can watch that go from here to here. And I think that's the kind of modeling we not only need to do for kids, but we need to do that kind of modeling for other teachers in our department who are still hung up on that, oh, my kids can't write unless I give them formula sort of mentality.
I was thinking about, Kelly, I don't know if it's in the released conferences on 180 days or not, but during the time when you were in my classroom that day with my seniors, I sat next to a student who'd been chosen valedictorian or was given a speech as senior class president and said, you know, how do I even start writing this? And I was like, I remember saying it in the conference, have you looked up what other people say in speeches? And he was like, oh, what a good idea, you know? And I was kind of like, oh my word, he didn't know that after being with me. And I'd only had him, you know, at that point, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, but I still felt like, how is that not an essential first step for any kid in writing?
Right. And what's even more interesting about that is this is a space we have to get kids to go to, is that in that instance, you didn't actually hand the kid a model. You asked the kid to go find some models to look at. And I think this gets to the essential thing that we were trying to get at in that article, and that is the kids have got to do a lot more of the wrestling throughout the process, inventing they're going to write, deciding what they're going to write, deciding how that the kids have to have, and they're not going to like it. It's much easier to you know, give me a formula and I'll follow it. Uh, Although there are a lot of kids who like it a little more because, like my daughter, would have freed her up to write whatever the heck she wanted to write in that situation. But when we remove the wrestling, when we decide, okay, you're incapable, we'll do some of this wrestling for you,
Yeah.
then we end up with Jillian, who's a student of yours, and Bryant, who's a student of mine. Your kids come into college, my kids come into high school, and they're floundering because the teacher's not giving them the 5-paragraph essay, the teacher's not giving them the rubric, and they haven't built the strength to do any of that wrestling on their own.
Yeah, and I think, the critical thing for us is that study of mentor texts allows us with kids to tease out what makes a great essay, story, whatever it is we're studying. And we create those anchor charts with kids, and that becomes the criteria for evaluating those essays. It isn't like you get no criteria or direction from your teacher, but you learn what is it that makes a powerful memoir. And as you study that, like the colors of his addiction, that piece you have used that you got in the LA Times, right? That's a powerful piece about telling a story. What's the drone view of that essay story? And then what are its parts? And I think that idea that you need to learn what all kids need to learn is how to do that work. And it takes a great deal of time. And the mistake we make is you have to learn the 5-paragraph form before you do the other forms. And in that process, we lose their own sense of decision making. If I'm writing my own poetry and my own stories and my own, all through, I'm learning how to make decisions.
You're learning how to make the decisions about what you're going to write about, who your audience is going to be, what interests you. But I'll also take it a step further. When I impose an actual structure on that essay,
Yeah.
how much of the decision making have I now stripped from you when I said this is exactly what your essays look like?
Yeah. I think that too, when I sometimes tell about doing a book talk where I basically told kids who the narrators are. And then I realized the first time I conferred with the kid, and he was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you did that, because I wouldn't have known who they were." And I thought, "Oh, I just did all the thinking for you." Like, we have to resist that instinct to go, let me make this smoother for you as you enter this book or you enter this writing challenge. And we over scaffold.
So I I think you're right. I think not only do we have to be conscious of that and not only have to fight against that, but I would even take it a step further and say, I think as teachers, I need to make that danger visible to my students. Like, I will actually say to them, you need to do this wrestling. It's important. I mean,
Yep.
I might even do some mini lessons here and there about how hard this is going to be for you.
Yeah.
Um, that this is the way it's going to be, and the reason is because hard work is going to lead you to a better place. I don't keep that secret to myself. I make that really, really visible. I know you do, but make that really visible in the classroom.
Well, I was also thinking about when we were doing digital composition this fall, and I put up on the screen, these are all the decisions I had to make to create this 1-minute video for you. What kind of music? Where do I put the
That
text
was
slides? Which,
really great.
and that whole list of what decisions I had to make as a writer stayed up while they began working. And I would, in my conferences, yeah, you need to decide, just like I told you, these are decisions I can't make for you because I don't know what's important here. You're trying to tell the story of someone that matters to you. I don't know what that story is or what parts are most important, what goes first.
So what an interesting exercise is maybe to show kids a piece. That's good in the digital, but why not show them a piece that you've written and maybe show
Yeah.
them a chunk and say, okay, I'm not asking you what it says. I'm asking you, what are the decisions I had to make as a writer in the first third of this essay? Get in groups, surround this text, and have kids really, really zoom in and examine the decision-making process. That they're, oh, look, she started with dialogue. She did this intentional syntax thing, and having kids surround that text and look at the structure. Is the essay better if this comes first and this goes second, or is it better the other way around? And
I
having
remember
kids.
you doing that in a quick write, showing kids what you'd done in a quick write, and you asked them, well, now I'm thinking about moving this sentence first. And Don Murray used to say to me, he'd read through my writing and then he'd go, hey, your piece starts here. And it'd be halfway through page 2. And I'd be like, what about all that stuff I wrote in page 1.5? He'd be like, no, I can feel it. It picks up right here. And that was such a good exercise in reading your own writing to say, okay, you don't need, or this is getting off, you're really going into a tangent here. But you and I have written for decades. And when we're faced with those kids who say to us, well, I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. It's so important that we keep asking questions. So I told you as we were talking about this little discussion, I stumbled upon one of the conferences that's on my website from 2014, where a girl had come for after school help on a college admissions essay. And I have never met her before. And in it, she starts telling me about the essay and I go, well, that's a really interesting structure. Why did you choose the 5-paragraph form as a structure for this? Instead of framing it like, wow, this is not working, it was really about, talk to me about why you chose this. She did not choose it. It was the one thing she knew how to write. That comes out as she talks, and I'll post it attached to this, not because it's a great conference, and please forgive the hair, but because it's one of those moments. Oh, the camera angle too. It's tipping down the page, so you're watching us. But the whole point of it is, if you examine the way I'm trying to help a kid who's never really thought this way, figure out how I'm trying to turn this Titanic around, because she's writing an admissions essay. She's going to go to college and she can think of one way to write. Breaks my heart.
Well, isn't that an interesting idea? Because I think a lot of teachers out there who might argue, hey, if I give them structure, I'm preparing them for college. But in the book that we're currently writing, we're making the exact opposite argument. Wasn't your freshman Jillian, wasn't she in a class where she had to, I forget what class it was, but she had to identify a quote unquote wicked problem?
Oh yeah, well, it's called Tackling a Wicked Problem, and it's freshman seminar on my campus, interdisciplinary. So across all of these content areas, teachers volunteer to teach it. And then students look at a problem, mass incarceration or climate change or whatever, and they have to come at that problem from one lens of one of those content areas. So you might look at the scientific arguments, or you study that and write about it. Well, Jillian, she came to me right away and was like, okay, so do I use 3 different things? Do I have an introduction and 3, and it was a multi-page paper. And it echoed this conversation I had with my daughter in her freshman year, where she said, Mom, I have a 10-page paper due, 4 of them for the first semester. Does that mean that I plan them 2 pages per paragraph?
Oh.
Right? And I was like, wow, AP did not serve you very well.
Right.
That's the form that she practiced. And it's also why her school and many others don't accept AP as freshman comp credit, because they say it's too narrowly focused on passing that AP exam. Yeah, it's a challenge.
So coming to what we touched on a moment ago, what an interesting idea, though, to shoulder up with a kid who's lost, who's written a whole bunch of stuff. But how many times have you said to a kid, this is the hot spot of your essay?
Yeah.
This is it, right? And, might even have kids trade papers and say, find your partner's hot spot. What is the most interesting moment in that essay? And then that becomes sort of a prompt to maybe reorder your essay, that maybe that should be the beginning. What would happen if that became the beginning of your essay? And doing that kind of wrestling and rearrangement of ideas and texts.
Well, and you made me think of, sorry, go ahead.
We did this yesterday in what we were writing, both in our book, and I'm writing sort of this online lesson plan for teachers during this, coronavirus pandemic, and I'm going public with this thing. And I spent yesterday just kind of going, oh, it's better this way. It's better this way. When we do all that, that's how we write. Why do we hide that from our kids? They need to see us wrestle. They need to see us think out, is it better this way? Is it better this way? That's a different kind. That's different than assigning writing. That's actually modeling the wrestling match that we undergo every single time we write. You and I, before we recorded this, we talked for a long time this morning about something that we're writing, and I don't
Yeah.
know. Do you like this rearrangement? Do you think this should go here? Should this go in the first chapter? Should this go in the second chapter? I mean, I think kids would be surprised sometimes to see us, the teacher, having that kind of struggle. But I think that's the wrestling we want kids to do and emulate.
Right. I was thinking about when I finally sent you, I don't know, it was maybe 500 words the other day. And I said, actually, that took me 3 hours to find in my notebook. Like I couldn't figure out with the clarity that I can now speak about it until I had done all this like mess. And I was thinking about this. We used to talk about, I was teaching in the night school. And one night a week, I had these kids for 3 hours who had failed an English class at the high school. And I had this young girl who was 13 when she had a child. So she was in my class at 15 with a 1.5-year-old. And she had written this entire block of text trying to write about all these events in her life. And I remember saying to you, okay, I want you to tell me what you would say to this kid in conference. Then I'm going to tell you what I said. And I just want to know, because we never know, like as teachers, we're like, is that the right move? And what I had done that night was say to her, you have so much important stuff going on here. What I'm going to do is just hit the return key every time you're telling me something that's different than the other thing. The way I looked at it, she didn't even really understand what a paragraph was. So I hit the return key, and at the end we had this page with like 1 or 2 sentences per, paragraph. And I just said, now, can you see how these are all different? And she said, yeah. And I said, so choose one that you have a lot more to say about and just say a lot more about just that one thing. Don't go to the others. And she ended up moving from that to another one. She didn't need me. And it wasn't perfect writing, but it was that sense of, so if you're starting from 0, you still need the kid to make some decisions. Okay, so if at the end the kid has expanded 4 of them, do you need the others? And then what are the transitions that move a reader? And the kid has to create them again. And I feel like teachers will say to me, well, what's the graphic organizer I should use? And I just think we get caught in this trap of they must have to succeed. And I think it's just more complicated.
I remember that kid. I remember that. That was really rich, the moves that you made there. So in the spirit of trying to keep these at a reasonable length, maybe we should just pivot very quickly and say that in that article, we also talk about having kids make more decisions about their reading and while they're reading. Both you and I have talked a lot about, the danger of reading chapter 5 and giving kids the 4 questions, because if I have you read chapter 5 and you answer my 4 questions, then I have now framed your thinking. I have framed what you're going to think and what you're not going to think. And so one of the things that we've talked about, which is all in this article, is that a lot of times when we have kids read large chunks of text, instead of doing worksheets or handout or packet work, actually ask kids to develop their own, 2-page spreads and generate their own thinking. And in the article, which is linked and everybody can read it, you'll see like when kids come up with their own thinking. But here is another teacher in my district who teaches anatomy and having the kids do their own thinking when they create, when they're reading about cells in that case. But that
so
it's not.
Show the slides we said we might mention here. And these were for our book clubs this fall, where we had our kids, my kids in New Hampshire and yours in Anaheim, in book clubs on Matt de la Peña's work. So this is me standing over their book club discussion, and you can see 3 kids' notebooks where what we ask them to do is to capture 2 pages of your thinking and bring it to the book club discussion. So they have something to talk about, but they're in charge of what it looks like and which parts they want to share. I love these guys. One of my students, very, just a simple T chart, the main character, and then he starts making this whole long list, and he never even got to what he was comparing it to. He just kept going and going and going about this character. But for him to capture all these important things he might use in the discussion. For another kid, it was using the sticky notes that the middle school teachers had taught her to use to pay attention to particular passages. Another kid, lots of narrative, and then she went back and highlighted, preparing for this group discussion. And one more, she used a lot of quotes from the book and then her interpretation of the quote or why it mattered.
Yeah. So again, the idea of as kids are reading, it's not just a writing issue, right? As kids are reading, we
Yeah.
want them to do that heavy lifting. We want them to do, a lot of that thinking, generating their own thinking, wrestling with the text on their own. Doesn't mean we don't teach anymore. It means start with them generating their thinking, and then we come in behind them and maybe work with them after they've shared what they've generated.
Yeah, and I think that the whole idea of what's worth talking about is a decision we hand to kids. In your book club discussion today, what's important in this last 70 pages that you read, you are really that dialogue notebook thinking that Bob Probst gave us, where you're, what surprised you? Very open-ended questions that allow kids to then control what kind of thinking is happening. So in the spirit of this, I got one last slide to share. And that is because we have a special guest coming up tomorrow. And that guest is, let me get rid of this, John Warner, who was a professor at Clemson, and wrote a book that we both think a lot of, Why They Can't Write. And I pulled this one quote from his book just because I think that the power of this book, the subtitle, Killing the 5-Paragraph Essay and Other Necessities, is something that all English teachers should be thinking about. And I'm just really excited that he's going to come on and talk to us about his thinking behind the book and since then.
I haven't met him, but I feel like I know him. So I'm looking forward to that conversation as well.
Me too.
All right. So thanks for joining us. And back tomorrow, we'll pick this conversation up and hear the thinking of John Warner. Thanks
Thanks,
everybody for
guys.
joining.
Stay safe, stay well. We look forward to seeing you soon.